Jack never did well with mornings. The slow, sluggish crawl of time before the caffeine kicked in was the worst part of his day. And today, it was dragging on like molasses. He stared blankly at the coffee machine, watching the brown liquid drip into the mug. The whir of the machine was oddly hypnotic, and Jack, groggy from barely 4 hours of sleep, felt the strange sensation of his mind starting to slip into that weird in-between state where you were conscious but not really there. The coffee finished brewing, and he moved to grab the mug, but his hand froze halfway to the handle. His fingers just stopped. It wasn't that he didn't want the coffee. He did. But it felt like someone else had control over his arm. He blinked, shook his head, trying to snap out of it. Nothing. His hand was still hanging in the air, like a marionette with cut strings. Okay, this is weird, he muttered to himself. He chuckled nervously, thinking maybe it was just exhaustion. He'd been working late at the tech firm, his mind constantly swimming in algorithms and data streams. But this wasn't normal. The feeling subsided as suddenly as it had started. Jack snatched the mug from the counter, almost too quickly, and slammed it onto the kitchen table. He stared at it for a moment, trying to shake the weirdness off. Maybe he was just overtired, maybe just a little too wired on late-night coding sessions and too much screen time. But then, his phone buzzed from the kitchen counter, the vibration echoing across the room. He ignored it at first, not in the mood for whatever it was. But it buzzed again, this time harder, almost as if it was trying to get his attention. With a sigh, Jack picked up his phone, rubbing his eyes as he glanced at the screen. Urgent, Jack Malone, read immediately. The message was short, direct. It wasn't from anyone he knew, just some generic government email address that looked suspiciously fake. Still, the message was oddly formal, almost robotic. Mr. Malone, please report immediately to Sector 7. Acknowledge receipt. This is not a request. Jack frowned. He knew this was some kind of joke, either a scam or someone pulling his leg. He wasn't even sure what Sector 7 was supposed to mean. But then his phone vibrated again. This time, it was a push notification, popping up on his screen as if he hadn't opened the first message. You have been selected for a routine procedure. Please comply and prepare for testing. Do not discuss this with anyone. A low chuckle escaped his lips. The message was ridiculous, and whoever had sent it clearly wasn't trying to be subtle. He shook his head, but then, something nagged at him. His fingers twitched slightly. As if on cue, his thumb swiped across the screen, opening a map application. And before he could stop himself, his fingers typed the address from the message into the search bar, Sector 7, he muttered to himself, tapping the screen. The map loaded. The location was nearby. Close enough that he could make it in 15 minutes, if traffic was light. Jack frowned. Maybe it was some kind of survey, or a weird government recruitment thing. Maybe they wanted to study his brain or something. But he wasn't the kind of guy to back down from a mystery. Especially one that sounded this ridiculous. The facility was a nondescript building on the edge of town, tucked between an abandoned warehouse and a gas station that had long since shut down. Jack parked his car in the lot, feeling the creeping sensation that he had wandered into something far stranger than a simple government test. But curiosity had always gotten the better of him, and today was no different. When he stepped out of the car, a chill wind hit him, and he shivered. The air smelled sterile, almost antiseptic, but the building before him looked like any other office complex. A sign outside read, Public Health Research Facility. No mention of top secret or anything that screamed conspiracy. He buzzed in. The door slid open, revealing a small, sleek reception area. A woman in a white lab coat sat behind the desk, not looking up from her computer. She seemed completely oblivious to his presence. I'm here for, he started, but she cut him off without looking up. Jack Malone, she said in a flat, professional tone, her voice devoid of any emotion. Please take a seat. Jack blinked, glancing around awkwardly. Right. Sure. The woman's eyes flicked to him for a brief second, then she gestured to one of the empty chairs, as if inviting him to sit. Jack complied, frowning as his mind wandered. What the hell was this place? Minutes passed. His foot tapped nervously against the floor. He glanced at the clock. 8:58 a.m. The hours felt like they were stretching. Then, with no fanfare, the woman stood, her movements jerky, almost mechanical. She turned to him with the same blank expression. "Follow me," she said, and Jack followed her down a long corridor, his footsteps echoing off the sterile white walls. Every step felt like he was walking into a trap, but the thought of just turning around and leaving seemed ridiculous. He had come this far. Might as well see it through. The room they entered was white, too white. There was a bed in the center, with a series of monitors around it, their screens filled with complicated data Jack didn't understand. His mind wandered, trying to focus on something else. "Anything else? You'll be undergoing a basic procedure today," the woman explained, her voice still devoid of emotion. "It will improve cognitive function. You'll be in and out in less than an hour. Please lie down." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Wait, what kind of procedure? What are you injecting into me?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she motioned for him to lie down. Jack hesitated for a second, but the cold, professional tone made it clear there was no room for negotiation. "Whatever," he muttered under his breath, as he lay down on the bed, arms at his sides. He stared up at the ceiling, trying to get comfortable. His heart was racing now, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he wasn't sure if it was from fear or excitement. His mind whirred with 1,000 questions, but the sterile silence around him made everything feel more ominous. The woman attached a couple of electrodes to his temples, which was when the first real wave of unease hit him. He felt it, just a brief moment of dizziness, as if his own body had just suddenly realized it didn't belong to him anymore. Then, a slight, almost imperceptible sting in his arm. He flinched, but the woman was already turning away, speaking into a microphone, beginning procedure. Before Jack could process the words, everything went black. The world around Jack flickered like a broken television screen. One moment, he was lying in the sterile, white room, the woman's indifferent voice echoing in his ears. The next, everything was black, thick and smothering. He couldn't tell whether he was awake or dreaming, or if he had somehow fallen into a different kind of reality. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, unresponsive. It was as if something was wrong with his mind, like it was lagging, as though he were a computer freezing on a loading screen. But instead of a spinning icon or a progress bar, there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of his own breath. A buzzing noise began to pulse in his ears, faint at first, then growing louder. His eyes fluttered open, and the room came into focus. The white walls. The bright, sterile lights. The medical equipment around him. But the buzzing was still there. He blinked, trying to clear the fog from his mind, but his thoughts were like static on a broken radio. His head felt wrong. The buzzing wasn't just in his ears. It was inside his skull, a vibration deep within his brain. He tried to move his fingers, but they wouldn't obey. For a split second, it felt like his entire body was locked in place. He wanted to scream, to do something, anything, but he couldn't even breathe properly. His chest tightened. The panic hit him like a punch to the gut. His fingers twitched. He could feel them. They moved, slowly, almost against his will. Then his hand jerked to his side, as if someone else had grabbed it and placed it there. His heart thudded loudly in his ears as his body began to move on its own accord. His arm, stiff and unyielding, moved up to his face. The sensation was unsettling. It was as if he were watching himself from outside his own body. He fought against it desperately. His mind screamed for control, but the harder he fought, the more he could feel the presence inside his own head. The buzzing grew louder, sharper, more insistent. Something else was in there with him, occupying the space where his thoughts used to be. It was the worst kind of violation, like someone had invaded the very core of his being. A voice. Soft. Echoing. "Don't struggle, Jack," it said, not from the outside but from within. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't his thoughts that he froze. His mouth moved, but no words came out. His lips twisted into a smile, though it wasn't his own. The voice in his head continued, "You're part of something much bigger now. Just let go. Accept it." The words were insidious, like a melody woven into his thoughts. Let go. He didn't want to let go. He couldn't let go. But he couldn't stop the voice either. His limbs were moving again, and his body sat up, like a puppet with its strings pulled taut. His eyes darted around the room. There was the woman. She was standing by the door, watching him with an expression of clinical detachment. Jack's hand rose again, on its own. He opened his mouth, but still, no sound came out. His throat felt dry, constricted. He was screaming inside, begging to be free of whatever this was, but nothing. Not a single thing moved in his body except for the commands that came from somewhere far beyond his reach. The woman stepped forward, her movements stiff. Her eyes were blank, and her smile was mechanical. "How do you feel, Mr. Malone?" Jack couldn't answer. The buzzing in his head intensified, but instead of pain, it began to feel oddly comforting. Like an anesthetic, numbing his thoughts. His body relaxed against his will. His eyes blinked slowly, almost dreamily, as if his mind were fading into sleep. His muscles no longer felt like his own. They were just there. It was so easy. Just let go. The voice in his head was warm now, soothing. "You're safe, Jack. You're going to be fine. You're part of the program now. You're part of something that matters." No, he thought, desperate to push back, to scream, to fight. But the thought wasn't his. It was just a weak flicker of resistance, like trying to light a match underwater. The woman stepped closer, and Jack's head snapped to the side as if his body had jerked against his will. "Mr. Malone," she repeated. "You will not remember this. You will remember only what we want you to." Her voice was flat, but the words hit him like a cold slap. He wanted to scream again, but the scream died before it reached his throat. I don't." His mouth moved without him. It was as if his lips were being guided by invisible hands. The voice in his head filled the void again, cutting through his weak protests. "You are ours now." His body moved without him. His legs swung off the bed, his feet hitting the floor with a soft thud. He stood, his hands reaching out, grabbing the woman by the arm, and for a moment, Jack's mind broke free of the haze. His own voice returned, desperate, angry. "What did you do to me?" His words were jagged, frantic, but the woman didn't flinch. She simply stared at him, the same mechanical smile on her lips. "The procedure has begun," she said, her voice devoid of any empathy. "You'll be functional again soon, Jack. The process has already started. You're part of the network now. You'll do as instructed. It's easier that way." Jack opened his mouth to shout again, but the words wouldn't come. His body began to move on its own. His feet carried him across the room, toward a small exit door. His hands fumbled in his pockets, but they were moving of their own accord, as if they knew exactly what they were supposed to do. His mind was fraying. The resistance was fading. The voice in his head filled the gaps in his consciousness like a song that wouldn't stop playing. He was so close. He could feel it now, like a thread pulling him forward. He stepped into the hallway, and the lights flickered above him. Each step felt distant, as though he were moving through someone else's body. His eyes darted around, but everything felt muffled. Like a dream he couldn't escape. Then the thought hit him, what if it was a dream? What if he was never really awake to begin with? But the thought faded almost as soon as it came. There was nothing else now. Just the voice. Just the whisper of his thoughts being rewritten. "Mr. Malone, you're ready for your assignment." He didn't want to move. He didn't want to go along with it. But his feet carried him forward, down the long corridor, to the elevator. The woman was there again, standing next to him, her expression vacant. She pressed a button, and the elevator doors slid open. The moment he stepped inside, the doors closed behind him with a soft chime, and everything seemed to go quiet. Jack stared at his reflection in the polished elevator wall. His face was blank. Empty. He barely recognized himself anymore. His thoughts, his body, they weren't his own. Not anymore. The elevator began to descend. Down, down, deeper into the facility, to wherever it was that they were going to finish this procedure. Jack closed his eyes. He didn't know what was real anymore. Didn't know what was happening to him. All he knew was that he had to find a way out. He had to wake up. The elevator slid to a stop with a muted chime, the doors opening to reveal a corridor lined with unmarked doors. Everything was so clinical, so meticulously ordered. Jack's mind felt as though it were floating just outside his body, as if he were a spectator in his own life. He was aware of his movements, aware of the sensation of the cold, sterile air that surrounded him, but it all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. The woman led him down the hallway, her footsteps clicking sharply against the tile floor, the rhythm hypnotic. She didn't say anything. The silence was oppressive, thick with an expectation Jack couldn't place. At each door they passed, Jack felt a strange pull, a cold rush of unease that made his skin prickle. He could hear the faint hum of machinery coming from behind them, the buzz of hidden technology, but nothing else. They reached the last door at the end of the hall. It was black, no labels, no indication of what lay behind it. The woman's hand hovered over the door panel, a flicker of recognition passing through her eyes, before she pressed her palm against the surface. The door opened with a soft hiss, revealing a dimly lit room, filled with strange equipment and blinking lights. It looked like a mix between a laboratory and a control room, though everything was far more advanced than anything Jack had seen before. Inside, a man stood waiting by a large chair in the center of the room, his back turned to them. When the woman stepped in, he turned to face Jack, his expression neutral. "Jack Malone," the man said, as though he had been expecting him all along. His voice was cold, clinical, and somehow disarming. "We've been waiting for you." Jack didn't speak. He couldn't. His mouth was dry, his chest tight. The voice in his head was louder now, commanding, reassuring. "You're ready for this, Jack. You will be better. You'll be part of something great." The words washed over him like a tide, but it wasn't his voice. It wasn't his mind. He tried to push back, to fight it, but the sensation of being controlled grew stronger, suffocating him. He wasn't sure if his thoughts were his anymore. He wasn't sure what was real. The man in front of him motioned toward the chair. "Please, take a seat. The process is almost complete. We just need to finalize your integration." Jack's body moved before he could stop it. His legs carried him across the room, the sounds of his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. His mind screamed for control, but it felt like shouting into the wind. He sat down in the chair, the straps on the armrests clicking into place, securing him in place. The man stepped forward, and the woman followed, standing by the wall. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, and he tried to twist his wrists, to break free from the restraints, but it was useless. His muscles weren't responding the way they should. "Jack," the man said again, his voice still that cold monotone. "What you are about to experience will be unlike anything you've ever felt before. The nanobots we've introduced into your system will take full control. They will enhance your abilities, your cognition. But more importantly, they will make you ours. Forever." The words sliced through the haze in his mind. Forever. Jack felt a sharp pang of panic. No. No, this can't be happening. But the resistance was weakening. Every thought felt muddled, every flicker of rebellion squashed before it could grow. A needle slid into his arm without warning. The sting was sharp, but it barely registered. His body relaxed, but the buzzing in his head only intensified, drowning out all his thoughts, all his protests. The man didn't wait for Jack to react. He turned to the console by the wall, his hands flying over the buttons and levers with mechanical precision. Subject integration complete, the man announced, his voice now echoing in the small room. The final phase begins. The lights in the room flickered, and Jack felt a wave of cold rush through him. A cold that was more than just temperature. It was as if the air itself had become sharp, biting, invasive. He could feel the nanobots in his bloodstream now, moving, expanding. They were inside him, changing him, altering his very thoughts. You belong to us now, Jack. You belong to the future. The voice was louder now, clearer. The words wrapped around him, and he felt his body, his mind, begin to give in. It was easier. So much easier than fighting it. He was slipping. Slipping into something new. Something cold and distant, but undeniably powerful, but then, in the back of his mind, a flicker of resistance. A tiny, stubborn spark of awareness. Jack's own voice. No. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The voice, the one inside his head, faltered for a moment. For the first time, it sounded less certain, less commanding. Jack felt the slightest glimmer of control return to him. I am not just a puppet, he thought, his mind racing. I won't let you have me. Not completely. The man at the console didn't notice the subtle change. He was too absorbed in the process, in the operation. But Jack could feel the nanobots moving inside him, probing his consciousness, trying to reprogram him. The battle inside his head was growing fiercer by the second, and with each passing moment, Jack could feel himself slipping further into their grip. But there was something more, something he hadn't anticipated. In that moment of clarity, Jack understood the truth. The nanobots weren't just controlling his body, they were controlling his mind. Every thought, every action, was being influenced, filtered through their system. And that wasn't all. They were making him forget. They were erasing him, piece by piece. He had to fight it. But how? He focused all his energy, every bit of willpower he had left, on the voice inside his head. I am Jack Malone, he thought fiercely. I am not a machine. I am not a tool. He concentrated on the simplest thought he could form. I am still here. I am still in control. For a moment, it felt like nothing happened. The hum inside his skull remained constant, the pressure of the nanobots relentless. But then, slowly, something shifted. The voice that had been speaking to him, Nano, as it had called itself, paused. The words, though still faint, were less certain. You are a part of us, it said. You will be assimilated. No. Jack clenched his fists. His heart beat wildly, and for the first time, he felt something other than the cold grip of the nanobots. He felt his own heartbeat. The voice inside his head hesitated again, as if confused. Jack could feel the nanobots surging in his bloodstream, trying to override him, to force him back into compliance. But Jack held on. I will not be your puppet, he thought. And as he focused on the thought, something inside him clicked. It was as if a wall had been broken down. He could feel it, a sudden surge of energy, a wave of clarity. His body was still strapped to the chair, but now, he could feel the nanobots faltering. He could feel them weakening. They couldn't control him, not if he didn't let them. With everything he had left, Jack focused all his energy on one last, desperate act. He reprogrammed himself. The nanobots pushed back, hard, but Jack had gained ground. Slowly, the buzzing in his mind began to fade. The voices started to quiet down, their commands growing weaker. His body shook, but it was his own trembling, not theirs. His eyes snapped open, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jack was himself again. The man at the console looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "What's happening?" he muttered, his eyes darting to the monitor. This isn't possible." Jack's fingers twitched, and then, with a strength he didn't know he had left, he ripped the straps off his wrists. The woman stepped forward, but Jack moved faster than she could react. He grabbed her arm, and without thinking, shoved her away from him. "Stay out of my head," he growled, his voice hoarse. He turned to the door, the once imposing black exit now looking like an escape route. The nanobots were still inside him, but they no longer had control. Not fully. Not anymore. With one last look at the stunned man at the console, Jack bolted out the door. His mind was still his own. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack was finally free.